Welcome! Today we are going to solve derivative problems with e to the x functions. So, first things first, the derivative of e to the x is e to the x. To solve this problem, if y equals e to the x, then d to the fifth y over d to the x to the fifth is... So this problem is asking us to find the fifth derivative at x equals 0. So we begin by writing the first derivative of e to the x, which is e to the x. Then we continue on to the second derivative, which is of e to the x, which is e to the x. We continue to the fifth derivative, which is e to the x. Then you simply plug in 0 into x. E to the 0 is equal to 1. Therefore, the solution to this problem is D1. Now on to the next problem. This one is a little more tricky. The derivative dy over dx of function y equals ln e to the x over e to the x minus 1. At first glance, you notice that ln e to the x over e to the x minus 1 is a composition. Thus, it has two functions. The outside function, fx, is ln x. The inside function, gx, is e to the x over e to the x minus 1. So we begin to evaluate this problem. The first step in evaluating this problem is to understand the chain rule. The chain rule is how you find the derivative of a composition. So to find f prime of gx, you have to do f prime times gx times g prime x. So we set this up. You're going to have g of x in f prime, and you're going to multiply that by g prime of x. So first we want to understand the derivative of ln x. The derivative of ln x is 1 over x. So we continue by solving the first part, this part of the derivative. So we have 1 over g of x, which is e to the x over e to the x minus 1. This can simplify to e to the x minus 1 over e to the x. Now that you have the first part of your derivative, you need to find the derivative of g to the x. So now we're going to find the derivative of this function. However, we realize that this function is in a process of division, so we need to use the quotient rule. If f of x is divided by g of x, f prime x times g of x minus g prime x times f of x over g of x squared is the derivative. So we begin to solve this. So we have f prime is equal to e to the x, g prime is equal to e to the x, and we begin to solve. So you have e to the x times g, which is e to the x minus 1. Then this will be subtracted from e to the x times e to the x. And all this is going to be over e to the x minus 1 squared. So we begin to solve. So we get e to the 2x minus e to the x minus e to the 2x over e to the x minus 1 squared. So these two cancel out, and now you are left with negative e to the x over e to the x minus 1 squared. This is the derivative of g of x. So now we plug it into the chain rule. So we multiply this by negative e to the x over e to the x minus 1 squared. So at first glance, we can see that these two would cancel out, and you'd be left with 1 e to the x minus 1, and these two also cancel out. So we are left over with negative 1 over e to the x minus 1. This is the derivative of y equals ln e to the x over e to the x minus 1, which is C. Thank you very much.